very warm welcome to the London Buddhist Centre. Particularly welcome if you've not been here before. My name's Jnanavaca, and I'm one of the teachers at the centre. I'm one of the people speaking this afternoon. And we've got a theme of, money, love, sex, and something else. Is it power?
Status.
Oh, yes, status, power, yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about love, which has got to be the most important of that, isn't it? It's got to be the one. Possibly sex, but possibly power, actually. Anyway, well, hopefully you can come to them all. I haven't got a sort of planned talk. I thought I'd just ramble on for a few minutes and see if that stimulates some questions from you, and then we can sort of take it from there. So, love. It's a sort of big word. It's a faceted, multivalent word, but it's very evocative. I think we kind of know that it is a very important word or a very important topic, and yet in English we sort of have different. We use the word in a very ambiguous way, don't we? Or we use it in lots and lots of different ways. So, I love gardening, I don't, but that would be a very different love to loving your job, perhaps, to loving your partner, to loving your children, to loving your mother. There'd be quite different experiences, quite different emotions, although probably there'd be some overlap. At least it would be, there'd be some overlap, but there'd be quite different emotional experiences, wouldn't they? And yet, even though we're not very clear in English, particularly about what we mean by love, when we talk about love as perhaps the meaning of life, we probably kind of know what I'm saying. I was just thinking about my parents, both of whom are dead, and both of whom loved me very much. They didn't seem to get on with each other very much, but they did seem to love me. And I can remember particularly my dad dying and him expressing on his deathbed regret, remorse and regret. I was quite young. I was an 11-year-old boy. And the regret, in a way, he put it in different ways, but what he was sort of, I think, expressing, at least this is how I interpret it now, is that he hadn't loved enough. He hadn't loved enough. He'd done all sorts of other things, but he hadn't loved enough. And he hadn't... Well, one of the things he was saying is that he hadn't been kind enough. He hadn't been kind enough, which is a very sort of ordinary state, kindness. It's a very simple kind of human virtue. But at the end of somebody's life, if that's what they feel they've been missing, that takes on an extraordinary poignancy. When the Buddha was dying, at the end of his life, we've got an account of the last months of his life, and it's a very beautiful account of his last months. And he'd had a friend and a companion, an attendant, for the last 25 years of his life, a man called Ananda, who was a cousin of his. Hi, come on in. Make yourself comfy. There's cushions here if you want to grab cushions. He'd had an attendant for the last 25 of his years of his life. And Ananda, he was a cousin of the Buddha, similar age, and there was a lot of love between them. Ananda had faithfully served the Buddha in all his kind of material needs. If the Buddha needed some water, Ananda would go and fetch it. If he needed food, Ananda would perhaps go begging for the Buddha. If the Buddha would see lots of people, Ananda would be the sort of secretary, as it were, for the Buddha. He'd served him very, very faithfully. And at the end of his life, the Buddha didn't seem distressed at all. The Buddha had realized the impermanence of all things to his core, to such a degree that there was no sense in the Buddha of a separate selfhood. He didn't have a sense of being separate as a fixed entity from the rest of the universe. So for him to be dying, for the body to be dying, didn't mean anything or didn't mean very much. It just meant a liberation of consciousness from body. But for Ananda wasn't enlightened, and he weeps. And so as not to distress the Buddha, he goes to one side, goes out of sight a little bit, to weep, to cry. The Buddha's lying on a sort of couch, well, on the ground probably. He's lying between two trees in a forest, in a grove. And Ananda is weeping. And what he says, according to the text that we've received, is he's weeping because he says, the light of the world is going out. I am losing my master. He who was so kind. He who was so kind. And the Buddha, you could say, was the wisest man who had lived until that time. He'd discovered enlightenment. He had seen through the delusion of selfhood. He'd understood how things really are. He'd understood reality as it is. But Ananda doesn't talk about his wisdom. He doesn't talk about his eloquence. He doesn't talk about how many miracles he's performed or any of that. What he says is, I'm losing my master, he who was so kind. So I just want to touch on that, because I think that kindness in that, perhaps in that very ordinary sense, but also in that very lofty, poignant sense, it touches on what we perhaps need to most value in this very big term love. It perhaps touches us at what's perhaps most essential for our humanity. When we talk about love, when I mention the word love, probably kindness wasn't the first thing that came to mind. Often what comes to mind is a more romantic love, a sort of feverish, passionate love. And I think that's because romantic love is the central love that's celebrated in our culture, at least in our modern day Western culture. Romantic love is seen as the height of human sort of emotion, at least romantic love when it's sort of reciprocated and all rosy. That is seen as the height of human experience, the pinnacle of what we're capable of. And our culture sort of relentlessly presents us with that story, from music to films to cereal packets to everywhere you look. That story is the central kind of myth of our times, or at least it's one of them. Perhaps status and money and sex are also similarly powerful stories that we are being sold. But romantic love is certainly a very, very central one. And from a Buddhist position, from a Buddhist point of view, in a way there's nothing particularly wrong with that, at least as a sort of starting point. I do think it would be better to be open to romantic love than to not be open to any kind of love. if you see what I mean. Buddhism has a word called prema for romantic love. Prema. It's a very beautiful word, prema. And it means this sort of romantic love, this love which is looking for fulfillment in another. Yeah? And prema is sometimes given a bad press in Buddhism, but actually it's better than hatred. Yeah, it's better than it's better than indifference and coldness. It's better than hard-heartedness. It's better than not being able to be in touch with emotion at all. It's got something. It's got something very valuable. So this myth that we're being sold, I don't mean it's completely wrong or bad. But there is a problem. There is a problem with romantic love. What would you say the problem is, if there is a problem? Yeah.
Completion in another.
Completion in another. And why is that a problem?
Because completion can only be found in you.
Yeah. Yeah. Completion can only be found ultimately in oneself. And we're looking for it in another. And right from the start, therefore, we're doomed to failure. Yeah? We're doomed to failure. Even if sort of they're a nice person, they love us back, they treat us well, they sort of meet our desires, even if all of that were the case, and that's quite rare in itself, yeah, even if that were the case, it won't lead to complete fulfillment. It won't lead to completion, as you put it, because it can't be done in another. But well, no, I won't say any more just yet. I'll come back to that. Hi, do grab some cushions if you'd like to pass some cushions. And would you like a chair? Somebody can go and get you a chair. You're all right standing there. Good. Any other sort of problems with prema? This myth that romantic love is the central. Yeah.
Also assumes that if you don't find it incomplete, it's not.
Yeah. So it assumes that if you don't find it, or if you have sort of, if it's not worked, if you found it and then lost it, if it's not worked, that somehow you failed, that you're incomplete, that life is somehow, you failed. And that notion that we're incomplete or that we failed if we don't have the perfect romantic relationship is the cause of a huge amount of suffering in our culture. But it's a sort of suffering that most people won't admit to in a very public sense. You might cry on somebody's shoulder if they're a friend, but you probably won't admit to in a very public sense, because it's often, as I say, coupled with this sense of, oh, I'm a failure. I'm unlovable. I am, no good at whatever it is, at relationships, etc., etc. That causes a huge amount of pain and suffering. And it's particularly poignant when you consider that the whole premise of finding fulfillment in another, complete fulfillment in another, is flawed. So we've set up at the centre of our cultural life something that is flawed and is bound to cause a lot of pain. Yeah? Wonderful. So I don't want to knock it completely, because, as I say, it's better than hard-heartedness or hatred. Yeah? At least we're open to one other person. But where I think we go wrong is that we invest too much expectation in it. It's the degree of expectation. It's the unrealistic delusion that this will fulfill everything in our lives that causes the pain. That is just mad. It's fine if you're 17 to have that delusion. Why not? I mean, at 17 you can be forgiven for it. But frankly, somewhere we ought to be growing up, and it's a bit of a shame if we're still chasing this delusion as grown women and men. It's a bit of a shame. It's a bit of a shame. So let me just pause there and see if there are any questions on any of that before I move on to what a Buddhist position would be. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but isn't it a very necessary part of finding ourselves or finding love or within ourselves or finding
You're right.
creation
Yeah.
or whatever? Isn't it a very necessary part? The love of man and woman or man and man or whatever, woman and woman, isn't that a very necessary part of finding our own love, all the pain and the stress? Isn't it? I'm thinking like one, especially in the West anyway, in my experience, maybe they go hand in hand. You almost need all the pain and the disillusionment to realise that's not it.
Well, that's an interesting. You've asked two questions there, and I think that they're both interesting. The first one isn't it a necessary this romantic love for one other person between? So it's romantic love between a couple. Isn't that a necessary part of the fulfillment, the path to fulfillment that we're looking for? And secondly, you've sort of taken it a bit further and said, do we not need to experience, tell me if this is what you were saying, do we not need to experience the pain and therefore the disillusionment before we realise that this won't work? Yeah? So I think that to take the first one first, I think that what is necessary for us to be fulfilled. Hi, come through, don't be shy. Come. That's all right. That's all right. Come on through. Do you want to pass some cushions over? So the first part of the question was, isn't it necessary that we have this romantic fulfillment in order to become more fulfilled ourselves? And what I'd say is that what is necessary is that we learn to empathize, that we learn to connect with other people, that we learn to really come out of this self-protected shell, that we break down the barriers of defensiveness around our hearts. I think all of that is really necessary, that we learn to really connect and empathise with other human beings and the world around us. That sometimes for some people happens in a romantic relationship. Yeah? That's the first time that they open themselves up. But it doesn't have to happen just through a romantic relationship. And the disadvantage of putting to say that it's necessary just in a romantic relationship is that a romantic relationship can come with all the other problems that we've started to talk about, that it doesn't ultimately work in terms of completion and fulfillment, and often it leaves you with a sense of failure if you don't find it. So what I'm saying is that connection and empathy is necessary, I think, for us to be really human. That doesn't have to be found in a romantic relationship. And the second part of your question, do we not need to experience the pain in order to be disillusioned with romance? Well, yeah, sometimes I think we can learn from pain, sometimes. But I would hope that we don't need it too much. I think the more intelligent we are about our lives and our emotions, the less pain we need in order to grow up. Yeah? So some people seem to move from one painful situation to another before, well, sometimes never, sort of realizing that it's unnecessary. Other people learn more quickly. So all I'm saying is that we could learn more quickly. Yeah? What I want to move on to is to talk a little bit about what an alternative is. If romance isn't at the centre of our lives, if romantic love isn't at the centre of the fulfillment that we're looking at, what is? And Buddhism has another word for love. And the word it uses is Maitri. Maitri. And Maitri is closer to the kindness that I was talking about at the start of this talk. One way of translating Maitri is that it's loving kindness. Loving kindness. So do come on in and find yourself a cushion and then a space. There's spaces sort of around. Perhaps make spaces if you... Or raise your hand if there's space around you and then somebody can see. Yes, there's loads of spaces. So help yourself to cushions and don't be shy. So then we've got these two words. We've got prema, which is this romantic love, and Maitri, which is often translated as loving kindness, and often contrasted with prema. And the difference between them, you could say, is to do with the degree of attachment. The degree of attachment. So when we're in this state of prema, in romantic love, we really do feel like we want something back from the other person. Yeah? We're dependent on something from the other person. We really want them to return our love because we need them for this completion. And often, if they don't return it, or if they don't return it in the way that we'd like, our prema can actually turn into hatred. Look at how relationships break and what breakups are like. It can actually turn into hatred. And that's because it was based on an attachment and in the end a self-serving need. Yeah? If you can have a breakup and remain friends, then to that degree your relationship wasn't based just on self-centered need. And people do. I've got friends who have managed to break up and remain friends. Somebody was telling me the other day of their parents and how they've broken up and remained friends, and they're happy with each other's partners, etc., etc. It can happen. And that, to me, then shows a real degree of maturity. Yeah? And in a way, Maitri is pointing to a love which isn't based on that sort of self-centered attachment. It's based on empathizing with kindness, with another person. It's based on that kindness. It's empathy where you want the best for another person. And if the best for another person means that they go and find another partner, that's what you'd want for them. Yeah? That would be Maitri. That would be this kindness, this unattached, this unselfish, unconditional love. And that doesn't have to be restricted to one person. Romantic love tends to be focused on one person, or at least one person at a time, doesn't it? On the whole. Let's not go there, but I must admit, I'm generalising wildly, and you have to forgive me for all those caveats in your life where it doesn't fit. But it tends to be exclusive. That's what I'm trying to say. Romantic love tends to be exclusive. Whereas Maitri, by its very nature, tends to just spread out. So when we're in touch with real empathy and kindness, it doesn't tend to just hook on to one person. It tends to spread out towards everybody that we encounter, everybody that we can meet, including ourselves. That's really key, that Maitri in Buddhism starts with a kindness, a well-wishing, a sort of positive regard for our own selves. And from that basis, it then spreads to others. So can you see how Maitri could be a path to the fulfillment that we're actually looking for, a path to our humanity, a complete fulfillment, where we feel fulfilled in ourselves, and from an overflowing of that fulfillment, we can empathize and be kind to others and feel connected with others. And that would really be a very, very beautiful and fulfilling, satisfying way to live. It would also help address so much of the world's issues. So let me just pause there and see if there are any questions or thoughts about the difference between Prema and Maitri. Yeah.
So in a sense, what you're saying is true love about letting go.
Yeah, you could say that. It's about letting go of self-centeredness. And Buddhism is a path that helps you. I mean, lots of paths might help you, but Buddhism is a very, very practical path to letting go of self-centeredness. But in more positive terms, Buddhism is a path of learning more and more to love without attachment, to develop kindness, to develop Maitri, to develop empathy. To the point, well, maybe I'll come on to this later, but to the point where you can achieve some sort of self-transcendence and even what Buddhism calls enlightenment, a waking up to how things are, through letting go more and more deeply of self-centeredness. Yeah, so it's a letting go. Yeah.
Do you think that without prema, it would be more difficult to form kind of lasting monogamous partnerships?
It's interesting that, because I come from an Indian culture. I mean, Indian culture is rapidly becoming westernized. So again, I'm generalizing wildly. But when I was growing up, I wasn't surrounded by this cultural myth of romance and the romantic myth being the only fulfilling thing. I mean, probably that's changed even in India now. But in Indian culture, certainly when I was growing up, a lot of partnerships, monogamous partnerships, were based on more sort of pragmatic terms, like you wanted a life partner. You wanted a life partner. You might want somebody with whom you want to have a family. You want to be able to get on with them sufficiently. And the romantic bit might come later, or it might not. But it wasn't seen as central. And that's a whole cultural... I can see, because of that Indian cultural upbringing, that what we've got in the modern day West is a cultural assumption. It's not necessarily the way things are. And I think we probably recognise that if you do have a monogamous partner for any length of time, that first romantic flush will at some point die away. And what you're left with, if it's going to be a lasting relationship, is kindness and empathy and interest and going beyond yourself and looking out for them, helping them, etc. And when that's mutual, it'll last.
So prema really would be, I guess, the way that you're describing it, it's almost that it would be more synonymous with infatuation.
Yeah. And intoxication, interestingly enough. So what Buddhism says is that in the state of prema, you're not really seeing the other person as they really are. Yeah, you're intoxicated, and intoxicated. It's an interesting word that we use it for drunkenness, because that's how it is. Actually, what you're seeing is a projection of of an ideal that you've got within yourself. You're projecting it onto somebody else very often, and then, if you're not careful, you can cause lots of pain. Yes, I've got lots of questions. I'll take you.
Related to this kind of
Can it be helped? Yes.
Meaning that
Yes.
things that they believe
Yes.
way. Would
Can
you
it be
try
helped?
to suppress those feelings?
Yeah.
Realize that it's not
No, it's a really good point. So I don't think suppressing works. Yeah. And yes, it's natural. There are biological factors. It's going to be natural to sort of fall in love. I think what we can do is not turn it into something that's sinful. Buddhism doesn't have a concept of sin. Yeah, so I don't want to condemn it in that way. What we can do is not put all our emotional expectations on one relationship to fulfill us. Yeah, we can try and let go of that over emphasis on just one person. We can try and own, if we can, our own projections and needs and see that they're our projections and needs rather than just expect somebody else to meet those needs. What we can also do is try and really empathise with our partner as a human being and let them grow and develop as they want to, not try and keep them as we want them to be. Yeah? And most importantly, I think we can cultivate Maitri, kindness, empathy, friendship with many other people. What happens in our culture is that we don't really value friendship very much. People have friends when they're kids, and then when they sort of find their partner and they settle down with their lover or their partner, often we forget about our friends. Yeah, I don't know if this is more typical for men than women, but often that's what happens. Whereas in the Buddhist path, friendship is seen as, if anything, friendship is seen as the primary relationship. So yes, have a lover if you really want one, need one, and are lucky enough to find one. So I'm not saying suppress it, but don't have it as the exclusive focus of your life, which everything around us tells us it should be. Yeah, and it's not. It's not. I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but I just want to, yeah.
I'm just interested. I'm kind of struggling with attachment sometimes in terms of, like, on one hand, to have a meaningful relationship of any kind, friendship or whatever.
Yeah.
I think personally there needs to be an element of reliability and loyalty.
There is, yeah.
So how does that go with, you don't need to be detached because attached to somebody, because obviously if you detach yourself,
Yeah.
certainly where you can't
Yeah.
be too reliant.
Yeah. So I think what you've got there is just degrees of attachment. Yeah. And what happens in the Buddhist spiritual life, if you are trying to practice the spiritual life, what happens is that you can't just condemn all attachment because we've got it. Yeah, and it's natural. But what you can do is work in your relationships to reduce it. And friendship, yes, we will have attachment and expectations of our friends as well, but they tend to be a little less emotionally loaded than the attachment and expectations that we have with a lover. And also what we can do with friendship is that it's not exclusive. We can have more than one friend. Because if it's non-exclusive nature, you don't try and hook everything onto one person. But what I was thinking of is that there's a whole path. You could think of this movement from I think there's a movement from not being able to love at all, yeah, from a hard-heartedness, to love with attachment, like prema, to Maitri, where, I mean, it doesn't have to happen in a linear order, but just bear with me, to Maitri, which is more unattached love, yeah, to something called Maha Maitri, which is wisdom and love combined. But I'll come back to the wisdom bit in a moment. If you think of it as a sort of spectrum and a path, you can sort of, rather than seeing it in black and white terms, you can start to see how you can move from more and more attachment to less attachment. If you look at the Western tradition, there is a tradition of this, but you have to go all the way back, I think, to Plato. If you look at Plato's Symposium, Socrates Socrates and others are talking about love. And when Socrates finally talks, he talks about the teaching of Diotima, who's taught him about love. And what you see is there's this path. So he talks about love, first of all, starting with you love one other person for their beauty. Yeah? So you fall in love, and it's exclusive, and it's one other. And then he says you try and see more and more people as beautiful. More and more people as beautiful. And see if you can spread this attraction to beauty to more and more people. And then see if you can make a connection between beauty and virtue. Because it's not just that beauty is separate from goodness. They're linked. So see if you can move from beauty in its outward form to the beauty of the mind of the person that you're falling in love with, or the virtue of the person. And then he says, see if you can move from virtue just in mind to virtue as a principle in life. So you move from attachment to one person because they're beautiful to more and more people, to seeing actually that that's linked to virtue and the mind, to then falling in love with beauty and goodness itself as ideals. Now that's a very simplistic way of paraphrasing what Socrates is talking about. But you can see that there's this gradual path to wisdom in the Symposium, in Plato. And Buddhism has something equivalent to that. So it's not about suppression. Buddhism often talks about transformation. You take the energy of love and you use that energy to reduce your selfishness and increase your capacity for empathy. That energy is really needed. Yeah. Let me just read you another tradition, Sufism, which is the mystical tradition of Islam, also has a whole path of love. Yeah? And Rumi, who's a Sufi poet from the medieval times, there's one poem that he starts off by saying, it's called Subtle Degrees, and it starts off, subtle degrees of domination and servitude are what you know of as love. Subtle degrees of domination and servitude are what you know of as love. So that's prema, yeah? That's often how the romantic relationship works. It's subtle degrees of manipulation to get what you want, to try and both partners trying to get what they want. And subtle degrees of domination and servitude are what you know as of love. And then he says, well, but love is different. It arrives complete, just there, like the moon in the window. I'll say a little bit more about that. But I like that word, that love is different. Real love is different. It arrives complete. Complete. You're not looking for somebody else to fulfill you when it's Maitri, when it's real love. It's real love. And there is, I think, a path there. It's a path that, I don't feel I've traversed by any means. It's a path that we all have to kind of learn. But I think it is a path that leads to greater and greater humanity. And for me, that feels like what life should be about. When my dad was dying and he said he hadn't been kind enough, when the Buddha was dying and Ananda said that he was so kind, I think they're pointing to something that is at the heart of being human, that is really, really important. Learning to love, in that sense, I think is what being human is really, really about. Buddhism takes it a little bit further than Maitri. What Buddhism says is that there's the possibility of Maha Maitri. There's a possibility of even kindness turning into something transcendental. And what Buddhism is aiming at is where we see through the whole delusion that we're a fixed and separate person, that we're a fixed entity. Buddhism says actually we're just, it doesn't use these words, but it's more like we're a sort of crystallization of energy. We're a temporary crystallization of psychophysical energy. And everything in the universe is just a temporary crystallization of psychophysical energy. And it's always, if you look closely, moving and flowing. None of it is separate. None of it is fixed. And it's only when we sort of don't see it like that that we think of ourselves as me. And as soon as there's this sense of me as a separate thing, I feel incomplete. And as soon as I feel incomplete, I yearn for completion, and I look for it often in the wrong places. And then I cause pain to myself and to others. What Buddhism says is that it's possible to see through that delusion of separateness. If we could see through that, what would arise is a whole new level of experience that we can hardly conceive of. It would be another dimension of experience. It would be consciousness liberated from identifying with just one form. It would be a sense of mystical union, you could say, with everything, or an empathy with all life, with all form. You'd see through the delusion of you and me and others. There wouldn't be this sense of absolute separation, not at the level of consciousness. Of course, physically we're separate, but not at the level of consciousness. And what would erupt spontaneously when you see through the delusion is love. But it wouldn't be love as we ordinarily think of it. It wouldn't even be kindness as we ordinarily think of it. Buddhism has another word for it, Maha Maitri. Maha means great, with a capital G. So it would be the great love. It would be the great love, which is based on wisdom, which is based on seeing through the delusion. So you've got this hierarchy, I think, between not being able to love at all, being so isolated and defended and closed, that we're completely shut off from others. I guess at the other extreme you've got sort of hatred. You've got sort of psychopathic states where people cannot connect at all. All that they can connect with is others through hatred. Yeah. All the way through attached love to less and less attached love, less and less self-centered love, more and more empathy, to something which transcends what we ordinarily think of as human emotion completely. And it would be love that is a spontaneous outpouring of wisdom, from wisdom. You had a question. Is it all right? Did I? That's good. That's good. Shall I just read you how this poem ends? So it starts with subtle degrees of domination and servitude are what you know of as love. But love is different. It arrives complete, just there, like the moon in the window, like the sun of neither east nor west, nor of any place. Desire only that of which you have no hope. Seek only that of which you have no clue. Love is the sea of not being, and there the intellect drowns. A journey to the sea is horses and fodder and contrivance, but at land's end the footsteps vanish. You lift up your robe so as not to wet the hem. Come, drown in the sea 1,000 times. The moon passes over the ocean of non-being. Droplets of spray tear loose and fall back on the cresting waves. 1,000,000 galaxies are as a little scum on that shoreless sea. That's a beautiful image of this self-transcendent possibility that lies in all human consciousness. And you know, he talks of love as a shoreless sea, a boundless sea. And 1,000,000 galaxies are as a little scum compared to that shoreless sea. That's what Buddhism is saying we are capable of experiencing within ourselves, within the human heart and mind. There is that shoreless sea, and all that keeps us from experiencing it is our delusion that we're some sort of fixed and separate entity, and our insistence on then looking for completeness, and looking for it in ways that don't satisfy, that don't fulfill. And the way out is really to learn to love, really to learn to empathise, really to transcend this notion of me at the centre of the universe, and then ultimately to transcend the sense of me at all as a separate entity. And what opens up is boundless love. Boundless love. Shall we leave it there?
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks.